This is a story that begins with an old projector and 2 old cans of film. There was a makeshift theater in the back of a garage in a Chicago suburb. It was my childhood home that I shared with my parents and my older brother, Richard. My father started his filmmaking hobby as a teenager, and in so doing, he immortalized a young man's adventure, a road trip, a trip to the far west, to Yellowstone. I had seen the proof of that trip projected on a sheet in the back of the garage theater, images of an expedition on the old back roads of America in the late 30s. But beside the old grainy images, I knew very little about that trip that began in Chicago at the end of high school. In 2010, as my father was dying, I got a quiet man to talk about his life. But about that trip, he said the memories were fading, but still on the film, and that they drove a sweet Pontiac coupe that some family member had let them borrow. I would have to fill in much of the detail of that story. To establish the route, the back roads of the day, I obtained a 1931 Shell Oil road map. The cover cartoon and slogan offers assurances that you'll find your way. The inside is drawn in red and blue squiggles and zigs and zags. No straight interstates in those days, but a handful of U.S. routes were designated national highways. The Lincoln Highway, I learned, was the first one they followed. Identifying the car was a challenge. I pulled a handful of still images from the old film and showed them around to collectors at car shows. Comparing hood ornaments, profiles, headlights, and taillights, we arrived at a consensus, a 1936 Pontiac coupe. A business coupe, so named because of the enormous back trunk, big enough for a salesman's samples or for enough camping gear to get you from Chicago to Yellowstone and back. On the internet, I found a feature posted about a similar car at a St. Louis classic car dealer and museum. Everything seemed to fit between the 2 cars, the taillights, the profile, even the view out the window. But I was not to see it in person. By the time I was ready to launch our trip back in time, the car was sold. Desperate for a closer look, I found a British modeling company that handmade replicas of classic cars. When it came weeks later, I was not disappointed. I had my Pontiac coupe at last, or at least in spirit. I told my brother Richard to meet me in Chicago in May of 2019. It was time to track down the Yellowstone story, 1 mile at a time. On May 14th, around the time high school seniors would graduate, we arrived in Dad's old Chicago neighborhood near Lake Michigan on the near north side. The easiest way to place it is with the view of nearby and historic Wrigley Field, my dad's favorite place. He was a catcher on his American Legion team, but the photo that stands out is the Army ROTC picture. Dad was a captain in the high school ranks. Everett, Bill Blome, grew up in a Chicago brownstone, as those apartment buildings were called. At his old address on Winchester Avenue, his building replaced now with a modern structure. But just down the road a few blocks, his high school is still in use, and my brother and I had a few words to say about his journey and ours. This is Amundsen High School in the Ravenswood neighborhood of Chicago. My dad grew up just a few blocks from here, and in 1936, he graduated from this high school. It was a new school back then, just 6 years old. Chicago and the nation were in the grips of the Depression, and people really didn't travel. They didn't take vacations. Dad had worked from junior high age on up, helping to support the family because of the Depression. But while he was a senior in high school, he planned a trip out west. It was going to be a grand adventure, and with his cousin Wilbur Schmidt, they borrowed an old Pontiac coupe, and they headed west to Yellowstone.
I'm struck by the sense of adventure and independence displayed by Dad and cousin Wilbur. To tell a story that's 83 years old, we looked at a number of sources, including Dad's 1936 Viking yearbook from Amundsen High School, a number of family pictures, including this picture showing him as captain of the ROTC. And there's another remarkable resource, and that is 8mm film that Dad shot with his own camera all those many years ago, documenting his journey out west.
With that and graduation days, both real and imagined, behind us, we embarked on our journey in our version of a road trip car, a 2019 Subaru Outback. We eventually pulled out onto US Highway 30, a mostly straight line and still two-lane road headed west towards Iowa. It was like escaping the gravity of greater Chicagoland and easing ourselves into rural America. Crossing the Mississippi River. This is where the old 8mm film begins. It's a narrow bridge that leads Bill and Wilbur to their first new state. Our crossing is less dramatic, a lot less. Our first bridge has no superstructure overhead, and good grief, the river flashes past. There's no drama here, no sense that you've crossed the mighty Mississippi. Did we miss the right old bridge? We'll look into it. But for now, we are in Clinton, Iowa, where the river levee still draws a crowd to watch the traffic of riverboats and motorists and trains crossing the country. There are still relics of the old days in Clinton, an old mercantile. The old passenger train station. But the skyline has a new look, an ethanol plant that now dominates the skyline and the local economy. Day 2, a lingering question. What of the old elegant steel bridge? Maybe one that crossed the river somewhere else close by. Rock Island is a short drive south and known for its many bridges, so we made a detour. And yes, we found a classic old steel bridge. It was not the right one. This a double-decker, but still, it brought us some of the spirit of the old highway travels. Soon enough, we were back on US 30 headed west and beginning to learn the history of this roadway that was first laid out in 1912 and complete by 1920. The old 8mm film showed this route in 1936 as narrow with only occasional traffic. We found a busier highway. In some places it was the old roadbed, but mostly it was new, pulled straight by highway engineers over the years, sometimes widening to 4 lanes, then squeezing back to 2 lanes, but so much wider than it was. The film tells us there was a first stopover. No, not the western state, but the Iowa town of Nevada. One of the neat things about the old film is that when they get to Nevada, Iowa, both Wilbur and Dad are sporting some pretty nifty hats. Wilbur has a little white cruiser, and Dad has a fedora that would make any fan of Raiders of the Lost Ark jealous. So I thought it only appropriate that I come up with a hat, and I found a Stetson. Pretty good match. With 320 miles behind them and new hats, the boys were welcomed to Nevada by friends or distant relatives. We're not sure, but the town was used to visitors and welcoming. In 1936, if I was going to travel from Chicago to Yellowstone,
you would have taken the Lincoln Highway, because that would have been the only east-west road that would have gotten you there. So, and that would have definitely come right through the town of Nevada, and it would have taken you all the way to Omaha, but I'm pretty sure he probably would have turned off somewhere before there to head up to Highway 20.
Chris Corbin, high school teacher and local historian, tells us about this central Iowa town that celebrates the old highway. Iowa roads in the early 1900s were more likely to be rutted dirt, even in some towns. But the new century brought automobiles and pavement, and the idea that roads should cross America.
Lincoln Highway is the first transcontinental roadway built in the United States. Dwight D. Eisenhower would have been part of it because they took the trip back in 1919 to see how fast they would take the military to get from one coast to the other, and then they decided to build a road that would be able to handle that.
Our view coming into town was modern, but still familiar. A Midwest farm town offering an invitation to rest.
36 would have been a great time to drive around.
Was it a welcoming place?
I feel it was. I mean, I think Nevada today is still a welcoming place. I mean, people were very cordial to people coming through town. I mean, you have to be when you're one of those people that, like I said, on the crossroads, because everybody's coming, either northwest, southeast, west, whatever, they're coming through here. There was, like I said, several gas stations in town, They all sold tires and gas, whatever, full service. We had a log cabin type building that's just outside of town. And then you had the Conoco station just as your father would have came into town. There was a gas station there, but they had little bungalows behind that. And then you had what was called the Sleep Night or the Siesta Motel on the end of town.
For two city kids who grew up in sprawling Chicago, discovering a small farm town must have been a road trip pleasure.
The downtown was bustling. The courthouse was the old style. It was just, people were friendly. You could walk downtown and it didn't matter whether they knew you or didn't know you. They'd still talk to you, you know. As a matter of fact, they were probably inquisitive to find out where you were from, because they were digging for information to find out what the outside the world was like, you know, because you didn't, I mean, they did travel, but they didn't travel, you know, like we do today.
So if my dad and his cousin had arrived here maybe late in the afternoon, been walking down the sidewalk as we are now, what would they have seen and what's different and what's changed?
Downtown would have just been bustling. Cars would have been in every parking spot. The evenings, people would have come out. It just would have been a thriving area. I mean, restaurants, grocery stores, all sorts of things, and people would just come out and you meet your neighbors here. And to a degree, we still have that, but of course back then it was pretty much the only form of entertainment. And so there just would have been a whole lot of life going on.
Henry Corbin, Chris's son, took us on a walk through downtown Nevada. He points out that one place to meet neighbors was the Circle Theater. Still a landmark downtown, albeit with a new name, but still fulfilling a community need.
In the 1930s, it still would have been putting on some entertainment shows, more plays and stuff, movies. It's been a theater since day one.
And as the sign reminds us, it is still in use today.
So small towns are more or less known for their friendly receptions, particularly here in Iowa. Would they have felt welcomed when they were here?
I think they would have. Our town's always been a very inviting one. Of course, I'm partial, being born and raised here, but I think it's inviting. People would have just been curious, you know, new people in town. There's always a little bit of excitement with that. But I think they would have been invited in at the restaurants, and people would have been very sociable and friendly to them. And that saying "Iowa nice" is a real thing in this community. You treat people like your neighbors, and you treat them like you'd want to be treated. And that's something that I think was true back then and is still true to this day.
There was one more discovery to make here. When we showed off our Model 36 Pontiac Coupe, we were challenged to see Henry's real 36 DeSoto.
You had a pretty fun ride. Just kind of thinking, as an 18-year-old going on a trip like that, you would have just felt like you had the world by the tail. I mean, it would have been fun. You would have had power. It would have just been a great experience. It would have been just a fun time.
It was hard to compete with a real 30s model, but it was fun to draw comparisons.
Absolutely. So through the radiator with those horizontal bars and the chrome, pretty much the front clip of these two are very similar. That 30s beautiful swept look, those big front fenders and headlights. He has the fog running lights, which are quite the cool thing though.
And a lot of power?
Oh yeah, a lot of power to them. I mean, for a car of even this size with a four-door sedan, it's enough power that you still feel like it wants to get up and go. In a coupe, that would have just been fun. I mean, that would have been about the most fun you could have had, you know, as an 18-year-old driving. But yeah, that would have been an awesome time.
And with that bottom line, we took a short ride. Westward on the Lincoln Highway, 2 days out, and our trip across the Midwest has logged 320 miles, but there are still many days and 1,000 miles ahead. Across Iowa, springtime continues to green up the landscape. The historic old highway pulls ever straight westward, and passing through small towns, there are reminders that it is graduation time once again for young people with dreams to fulfill. Well into day 3, it's time to leave the Lincoln Highway. We jog north to another historic route, US 20, and then head west to cross the Missouri River and on into Nebraska. A common scene these days are windmills. Giant power grid-linked windmills now dot the Midwest and the Great Plains. Not so in the 30s. Those windmills were smaller and more functional for a farm, pumping water mostly. And here, along the side of the road in Nebraska, a small collection paying tribute to the creative windmill designs of yesterday. We continue west and will spend our third night on the road in Ainsworth, Nebraska. But as we approach town, a tornado warning forces a quick stop. We wonder if Bill and Wilbur face such springtime weather. Ainsworth is welcoming but an isolated town. A few relics remind us of days gone by along this roadway. Another part of the landscape are the rail lines. Moving mostly commerce these days, they were once people movers as well. In 1936, the trains were steam-powered and hauled passengers as well as freight. Today, they don't stop for passengers, but still blast away the seemingly endless miles linking our centers of commerce. But like the 1936 trip, they are ever present on our horizon, pacing us west. Our landscape is changing fast. The sand hills now dominate the view. Prairie grass holds down the massive sand dunes that cover a quarter of the state of Nebraska. They host ponds, send water into the aquifers, and support large herds of cattle. But the massive row crop farms of the Midwest are slipping away. In Gordon, Nebraska, 775 miles into our trip, we leave US 20 behind and turn north towards South Dakota. Although we are still on a western trip, we continue to drift northward. From here, it's 130 miles to the Black Hills and Mount Rushmore. We've got good pavement. The cousins had narrow dirt roads. In 1936, Mount Rushmore was still a dream project in progress. As seen on the old film, workers were still scrambling across the face of President George Washington and working around his forehead. Today, the scene is much more orchestrated. Something like Disney meets the national parks. A grand walking boulevard leads you to the amphitheater and the overlook to view our famous 4 presidents. The carvings began almost 10 years before their trip. Today, a museum details the carvings by sculptor Gutzman Borgland and his team. We learned from rangers that encouraging visitors to see the work those years ago was all part of the promotion.
Who would have thought that the home movie we saw years ago, projected, I think, first in the garage, on Williston Street on a white piece of paper or a white sheet showing Mount Rushmore and bears feeding, being hand-fed the side of cars, would turn into a pursuit like this, to try to redo a journey that happened 83 years ago on a westward expedition. So I just think that's my first memory of this film, and here we are, chasing it down.
Well, I remember Dad really proudly showing me these movies in our living room, and still, even now, thinking what a remarkable and forward-thinking person he was in terms of shooting 8mm movies back in the 1930s. The cinema industry was still developing its own technique, and here he is shooting 8mm movies, and we have this lasting record. Going back to this kind of sense of adventure, 2 young teenage men just graduating from high school, making the trek to this place and not even being halfway to where we're our ultimate destination.
On day 5, we pull out of Rapid City, South Dakota, and find the weather changing fast. We are headed west again, and even though it is late May, it feels like winter. We have a 460-mile day ahead of us, and we have to join the interstate for a time to get there. First up to Sheridan, then across to Cody. As we enter Wyoming, we are greeted with a winter scene. The welcome station is dusted, the mountains holding snow. The road ahead is getting to look more like the West. One of the keys for this trip, for the route and agenda, comes from tour stickers found on a back window of their car. It begins with Mount Rushmore, then adds Sheridan, where we are headed, and then on to Cody, just before we get to Yellowstone. Sheridan is definitely a Western town. We begin to see a pattern, sculptures capturing the spirit of the West in all its animals and characters are decorations across the townscape. Then we turn into the clouds and into the mountains. Cody, our next destination, is 160 miles to the west with a mountain range between us.
We're heading toward Yellowstone and crossing the Bighorn Mountains, the road topping out at about 8,500 feet. Dad and Wilbur might have come this way, although their crossing was probably more difficult. And yet, these mountains and this scenery, absolutely timeless.
Later, on our 5th day of travel, we pull into Cody, Wyoming, almost there, and for the first time, we arrive in an old motor court motel, something that would have been more familiar to the guys. The sky is still overcast on the next day, with rain and flurries, but we find a world-class museum, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, really 5 museums in one. My brother, who is a docent at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., is delighted to find that this museum is a recognized affiliate of the Smithsonian in name and quality.
My name is Bob Richard. I was born and raised in Cody. I'm a 4th generation. I grew up here, went away to school, was a park ranger in Yellowstone, started as a seasonal.
As luck would have it, we asked to meet a longtime resident of Cody and the Yellowstone country, and we struck gold. Born close to the year my dad and cousin made his visit, Bob Richard fit the bill.
Grew up in Cody. Yellowstone is my backyard. As a young man, I led pack trips into Yellowstone and into the mountains, 10-day trips. But I grew up at the age of 12. I took a pack trip with 6 guests, and I thought I was really the leader of it. But I had a cook that had been cooking for 32 years for my granddad, and I had a horse wrangler that had been with my granddad for about 20 years. But I thought I was in charge. Boy, did I learn a lot.
After guiding and ranching most of his young life, Bob Richard entered adulthood on a horse, working for the National Park Service.
I was the first designated horse ranger in the front country, talking with people, sharing and listening really to their experiences, but also correcting problems in campgrounds and that type thing.
Richard was the perfect person to ask, what was the town like when Bill and Wilbur came riding in on the Cody Town Road in 1936?
Well, the biggest difference is the town has probably tripled in size, and the streets are paved today. They were gravel and mud in those days. Cody was a much smaller community. They had a Cody Trading Company. We didn't have any of the chain stores. And the Irma Hotel that I mentioned that you need to stop and see was really the focal point in Cody. Bill Cody built it in about 1903, 1904. He actually put gold buffaloes on the doorknobs. They didn't last long. They disappeared. But in the restaurant, and you're welcome to go in, is a cherrywood bar that was given by Queen Victoria to Buffalo Bill after he had done a tour and a special presentation of his Wild West show in England for the Queen.
Cody today is a gateway town, the last stop on the east side before the drive up into the mountains and Yellowstone. Pretty modern today, but even in the 1930s, it was a stopping place for anyone bound for Yellowstone.
Yellowstone has been promoted by the railroads since its inception in 1872.
With an inspiring history lesson behind us, we drive on to finally enter Yellowstone. Driving up the Shoshone River, whose canyon carved out the approach that Dad and Wilbur had followed. Our route, a modern highway. Their road, a mix of dirt and gravel and makeshift pavement. Climbing into Yellowstone is the right way to describe it. It is high country, ranging from 5,200 feet above sea level to 11,000-foot mountain peaks. It must have been quite a climb for a Pontiac coupe. We reached Lake Yellowstone area by late afternoon, delayed for a time by road construction that might have seemed familiar to the cousins. Gravel and rutted and under construction, we crawled along for a half hour. Finally, we reached the shoreline of Lake Yellowstone. We had traveled almost 1,500 backroad miles to get here. Our goal to follow the backroads of the 1930s brought us across the same country as close as possible to their old route. Their lake was free from ice. Ours is still frozen over. We stayed in the grand old Lake Hotel, the premier lodge in the park and no doubt out of the budget of Dad and Wilbur. The campgrounds were not far away, the scenery not all that different. When we were back in Cody, we asked former park ranger and guide Bob Richard to help us identify the spots where the 8mm film had frozen in time the Yellowstone of 1936. With each photo, he named the spot and usually added some memories.
But everybody has a dream of Yellowstone. And just like your family, when they came out, they'd heard about Yellowstone, they needed to see it. They'd always heard about Old Faithful, the geyser, other geysers, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, Lower Falls, Upper Falls, hot springs, wildlife.
The roadside bears used to be a hallmark of a Yellowstone visit. We could only marvel at the interaction of hungry bears and visitors who didn't know better. It took a drastic change in park policy in the 60s to change bear and visitor habits. But today, the bears are elusive. In fact, we struggled to see a grizzly bear and finally found one at an impromptu roadside traffic jam. We had better luck finding elk. In fact, they were literally hanging around at park headquarters in Mammoth Springs. It's a safe place for elk birthings away from predators like wolves that were reintroduced in the 90s. Finding bison was even easier. They dominated the landscape and quite often the roadways. Back to the old film. We had our list to check off. I think the cousins ran out of film before they ran out of adventure. There were no film clips of the historic park headquarters in Mammoth Springs or of the magnificent thermal ponds that sit just down the road, stair-stepping across and down the mountainside, full of color and thermal life, ever expanding. It's just another reminder of the wonders of Yellowstone.
And every time I go to Yellowstone, I get excited. I find something new. I'm still learning. You're going to spend 2 or 3 days in Yellowstone, and you're going to wish you had a week.
A week would hardly do it. We don't know how many days Dad and Wilbur spent in the park, probably longer than us. You could tell by their brief on-camera appearances that they were enjoying it. They had enough snow to make snowballs. We had enough to cover the car on several mornings. We had rain and sleet, moments of sunshine, and magnificent scenery and natural wonders. We did not have enough time. Bob Richard was right. You need a lifetime to absorb Yellowstone.
Every time I go to Yellowstone, it's different. The beauty of the park, whether it's the trees, the grass, the wildlife, the geologic formations, it's always different. And every time, and I go to the park at least twice a week on my own, or I'll take friends. And I still haven't found everything there is.
9 days on the road and we come to the end. We turned some 500 feet of old 8mm film into a backroads journey to understand a young man's trip of a lifetime.
So I can see where Dad and Wilbur, as young, adventurous high school graduates, would have looked at Yellowstone as a fascinating and exciting and challenging destination. And what struck me is that you just can't really get the full sense of the tremendous scenery unless you see it with your own eyes. And the quantity, every turn, every mile has something new, something fresh, and just something astounding, really.
It was a trip of discovery for them, and for me, I was discovering his past. I could feel the footsteps, I feel the history. It's 83 years remote, and Yellowstone is nothing like it was, and yet it is. It is still the most magnificent natural treasure that we have in this country, and it was a good trip.